The Sonoran Desert is renowned for its iconic endemic species, and home to many people who are dedicated to studying and preserving them. Invasive species present a threat to desert ecologies that is growing, along with globalized plant trade, climate change, and resource depletion. Harmful and prolific plants displace native species and disrupt ecological processes like fire regimes and food production cycles. Today's episode is part one of an expansive conversation about invasive species and how they relate to regional land management strategies in general. The Sonoran Desert ecoregion spans 3 states in northwestern Mexico and 2 in the southwestern United States. Though the hottest desert in both countries, it is the most biodiverse in the world. For millennia, diverse Native American communities have been elemental parts of shaping and stewarding this landscape. European settlers arrived in the late 1600s, initiating what's sometimes referred to as the Columbian Exchange, wherein microbes, plants, animals, and people flowed between the Old World and the Americas. Tragically, indigenous populations declined by up to 95% in the subsequent 2 centuries, primarily due to diseases and violence introduced by newcomers. Some of the new species that Europeans brought over became useful staples, like wheat that could be grown in the winter for spring harvest when other native crops like corn and squash could not. Livestock animals made for new sources of food and materials and transformed agriculture in the region, birthing larger-scale operations in addition to the native auction techniques based on rainwater and floodplain cultivation. However, these, like many species introduced into a new landscape, created unforeseen problems. Along with mining, livestock farming brought about the most significant transformation of the Sonoran Desert in human history. Overgrazing was already a huge problem in the Spanish colonial period, but the 1880s kicked off an era of more intensified extraction. Anglo-Americans and even more Europeans came to extract precious metals, and global investments made the Arizona territory into an extractive colony for its famous 3 Cs: copper, cattle, and cotton. After the Mexican-American War, land grants for irrigating previously arid regions with transported river water caused new ecosystem disruptions. Urban growth and its water demand added even more pressure. Native staple crops and sustainable land management techniques were replaced by methods suited to support new industries and new populations. After just a couple hundred years, many of the plants and animals seen here now are brand new relative to those that evolved in this place. While specially adapted native species still thrive here, invasive species, introduced by globalized movement, are benefiting most from ecosystem change. The topic of native versus invasive species is actually a really complex one. Extending beyond biological concerns, it invites us to reflect on human histories and transgressions, the significance of indigeneity, and potential adaptations from where we are now. Kim Franklin is the Associate Director for Conservation at the Arizona-Sonora Desert Museum in Tucson. She's been observing relationships between plant and animal species for her entire career, including identifying invasives.
Zoos do a lot of conservation work, and to be accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, you need to do conservation work, and that's contributing to the conservation of the habitat of the animals that you keep at your zoo. And so we are a unique zoo in that we focus only on animals and plants that are from the Sonoran Desert region. And my team focuses on conservation of the habitat of those plants and animals within the Sonoran Desert region.
With such rapid change, classifying species becomes challenging. How do we determine what belongs in this ever-evolving landscape, and how we can best support it? To what degree is the label of invasive a human value judgment? What invasive plants should we be worried about, and why?
It's a plant or animal that's not, or it could be a microbe, not not native to this region. But more so than that, it needs to be one that's causing some significant ecological or economic harm to the region. And so that really limits, there are many, many species here that are not native to the Sonoran Desert, but very few of them are invasive. But there are other species that say are native to the southern regions of the Sonoran Desert that are now more common here. And so whether those are native or not native, I guess is, questionable. It's something people could argue about. And so there are many non-native grasses here and forbs. Forbs are like small herbaceous plants. And we know their native range is somewhere in Central Asia or something. And so we know that they're not native to here, but we might not know exactly when or how they arrived here in the Sonoran Desert. And in the early stages, we might not know if they're going to become invasive and are going to cause ecological damage. And then you start seeing species take off. It might be like weather conditions over a couple of consecutive years are just really favorable. And there's now a seed bank because it's been here long enough. And so it just explodes. And then you see the potential that this species has here in this new environment.
In such a unique desert as the Sonoran, there are, of course, many who dedicate their lives to active management of the land and preservation of its more than human relationships. Brian Powell is another one of these folks, and a veteran of the JSW podcast, featured on a previous episode detailing the collaborative creation of the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan in the 1990s. Brian now works in the Conservation Lands and Resources Department for Pima County here in southern Arizona.
So our team does a whole bunch of different things, but we manage the open space lands that the county's purchased. So we manage about 250,000 acres of land. Some of the higher profile parks like Tucson Mountain Park, Colossal Cave Mountain Park, Agua Caliente, Canoa Ranch, as well as all the ranches that the county purchased as part of the Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. We do environmental education, we do restoration, invasive species, we have a native plant nursery, we have cultural resource team here. In general, I think what we say as native is something that has been historically documented here for as long as we've been keeping record. Naturalized would be a good way to describe something that's sort of here and is not going anywhere. So period, that would describe a lot of problematic invasive species that become kind of naturalized. There are species that, javelina and just on the javelina and coati is that they are relatively new here, last 150 years, but we don't see them as a problem. They actually do a lot of digging. They sort of move soil, and we see those as, I haven't heard anybody say they're problematic. There have been over 230 or 40 documented invasive plants in our region. But really, a handful of them are the ones that we're most concerned about because of that sort of their ability to fundamentally kind of change things. We think about sort of structure and function of ecosystems. So structure being, the biodiversity. What are the species that are there? What abundance are they? Function is more things like how energy, water moves through systems. Those are related. Structure and function are related. We're most worried about those species that change that structure and function of natural systems. So bufflegrass is a great example. It's introducing fire into a system that has had no historical precedent for fire. That's why we're most worried about bufflegrass and stinknet and fountain grass, because they're the ones that really will change the structure and function of systems, as opposed to other invasives that kind of pop up here and there. They may be a problem, maybe maybe in smaller areas, but sort of from a kind of a systematic perspective, we're not as concerned about them. So whatever action we're doing, we're thinking about structure and function.
Bufflegrass has quite a notorious reputation in Tucson. It serves as a great example of how a plant introduced by humans, especially those who themselves were newer to the regional ecosystem, for one particular purpose, can become a major disruptor to its host landscape under certain social and environmental conditions. Bufflegrass was introduced in the early 20th century to help deal with erosion of disturbed soils at mining sites. It was promoted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, particularly in heavily mined areas like the Southwest, and was even bred into a cold-tolerant variety here. Today, buffalo grass is still actively planted in some areas of Texas and Sonora, Mexico. As Brian mentioned, though, the grass's proliferation has led to serious issues, especially because of its effect in changing fire regimes.
So buffalo grass was here a long time, and then it took off. And when it took off, we saw, oh my goodness, it's incredible at competing for resources here in this environment. And it can outcompete our native species. And people started trying to control it. It's difficult to control. And other people started researching what was happening in places where we weren't controlling it and noting the decline in biodiversity. And so you could see that ecological harm in the data. And so to just let it go in Tucson Mountain Park, you'll watch this slow transformation of these most magnificent saguaro forests in the world. I mean, these are some of the densest stands of saguaros in the world into a buffalo grass grassland.
Since buffalo grass did excel at stabilizing landscapes and proliferated so rapidly, it's been tested as a feed source for grazing cattle. But unfortunately, it hasn't proven great forage for native or domestic animals. And like all invasives, buffalo grass creates a ripple effect of challenges for its neighboring flora and fauna.
Deer have been anecdotally noted to eat buffalo grass in small quantities, and bighorn sheep, but it's not a primary food for them. Buffalo grass is less digestible, has a higher cellulose content, lower protein content, and so those native grasses are definitely the preferred food for both our deer, bighorn sheep, but also cows. Cows will eat buffalo grass, for sure, but they will eat native grass first. And buffalo grass doesn't have flowers that bees would go to. Nothing would go there to look for pollen or for nectar. But all these invasive grasses, by out-competing, say, for instance, wildflowers, once you have this carpet of grass, you don't have those spring wildflowers or the summer wildflowers, and those are food for the native bees. Our native bees are fairly picky eaters, a lot of them, and so they won't go to just any plant for pollen and nectar. They would go to a subset, maybe all the different species within one genus, or maybe a family. And so if you lose that group of plants, then these bees emerge from the soil in the spring or whenever they're triggered to emerge from the soil as adults and start their life cycle all over, and they can't find food.
We have to make hard decisions around where it is that we do tackle buffalo grass, because we can't, in the 250,000 acres where we manage, we can't take care of all the buffalo grass. We don't even know where it all is. Regionally, we don't have enough resources to address all the invasive species. And one of the things that we recognize is that we need to empower citizens to take control of their own properties, their own HOAs, their places that they love. So we have a long history of citizens coming out a couple times a month. We have a group that's out this morning that are pulling buffalo grass. So there's a lot of investment by the community in Tucson Mountain Park. It's one of our flagship parks. It's a place that people recreate, they care about. And so we've really focused on Tucson Mountain Park.
We are trying to support our land managers in installing boot brush stations so that people who do a lot of hiking or not brush off your boots before you walk into the trails. And I think they're trying to install one at every Tucson Mountain Park trailhead. The other thing I would say about people who hike a lot is that if you have an interest at all in learning about these, just a little bit, this may be the major ones, there are apps. There's a great one called Wild Spotter or EdMaps. They're kind of the same ones to report all sorts of species, and one's just for invasive species. But that can be really helpful. So we're going to be launching at the Desert Museum a community weed mapping effort soon.
Conservationists face a tough challenge when it comes to dealing with buffalo grass. Current methods for managing this invasive are largely manual and resource-intensive, so land managers have to be strategic about their approach. With limited ability to fight off its propagation, How do they choose which areas to focus on for invasive plant removal? What is the overarching strategy?
I think the first thing to say is that we're not trying to eradicate them. We're not going to eradicate them because they're so abundant in the environment now. There's no way we're getting rid of them, and they're abundant in areas adjacent to southern Arizona. They're abundant in the southern Sonoran Desert, well, bufflegrass is, and it's always going to be coming in. So what we're trying to do is manage them, trying to keep them in check in the places that we care about most. And so in the case of bufflegrass, it's fairly easy to keep it in check in the urban environment around people's homes. And so you can pretty easily eliminate that fire threat around homes, but keeping it in check in our wildlands is a lot harder. And so we may have to prioritize and pick and choose. We want to save Sabino Canyon. We want to save Tucson Mountain Park, or at least pieces of it. We want to save Saguaro National Park, or as much of it as we can. And then we don't have enough resources to do it all. And so at the Desert Museum and more broadly, our conservation partners, pushing native plants is such a important thing to do, because native plants serve native insects and animals, and they're like the base of the ecosystem. Without the native plants, then you have tremendous loss of biodiversity. And with native plants, even in an urban environment, you can support a tremendous amount of biodiversity. And then the managers that I work with, we're largely thinking about which habitat is important to protect as opposed to individual species. Definitely focus on the saguaros because that's something everyone can relate to, and it is an important species. But we're thinking more about the Saguaro Palo Verde Desert Scrub Association. So you find these vast Saguaro Palo Verde ironwood forests, and that's a very common vegetation type here. Palo Verdes are the state tree, and they're hugely important pollinator plants, and so really critical. But we're also thinking about the whole vegetation type and all the other species that are served by that vegetation type.
A lot of people think about restoration or conservation from some set point in their historical memory or documented, condition of the land that we have here. So kind of give a little context is if we were to be having this conversation 15,000 years ago in this spot, this would be an oak woodland. Right? So there'd be species associated with what you would find up 6,000 feet up in Mount Lemmon. 150 years ago here, the Santa Cruz River was running perennially at a mountain, right? Then we came in with cattle and groundwater pumping, and we no longer have perennial water in the Santa Cruz River. And naturally occurring perennial water will not happen in my lifetime or your lifetime. So what we're trying to preserve and conserve is sort of the baseline as it is now, and not some kind of historical reference point, because we have lost the soil and the groundwater conditions that would support that historical condition. So we have to put a lot of our work in different contexts of maybe right now is the best we can do, especially with climate change, and we want to sort of hold the line at like kind of where things are at now and not let them deteriorate. In a few cases where we can do restoration or conservation activities to kind of improve above the current baseline, then we'll do that as well. The baseline changes.
The driving forces behind the spread of invasive species are as complicated as the decisions we make to address it. Even in the most remote desert areas, the factors underlying a new species invasion are largely social in nature.
It's really dependent on the particular species, and we don't always know kind of like what are the bounds of that particular species. We do know that when we clear a property for development, say, we know that invasive species generally, upland invasive species, they love those disturbed soils. I think the biggest thing that probably is driving invasive species and the new invasive species is actually trade and the movement of people around the world so quickly. We saw it with the pandemic, right, where you can get on an airplane and all of a sudden now COVID is in Africa. So and the same thing is happening with invasive plant species, whereby people are going to South Africa, for example, on a vacation, and they walk through a forest, a stink net, and they get it in their socks and their boots and their boot shoelaces, and then they come back here and go for a hike, and all of a sudden, that's how. So increase in trade is really one of the things that's kind of really driving the presence of invasive species. But then once they're here, now they're finding their niche.
The Sonoran Desert is not the type of place that can support the lush green expanses of the classic English garden. Aesthetic preferences introduced with colonization have significant impacts beyond the scale of personal property.
So there's an interesting species. Bermuda grass is the common lawn species that we have here. And if you keep it mowed, it doesn't go to flower. It's also a terrible allergen, so don't let it go to flower and doesn't set seed. You can use it as a lawn grass. Becomes invasive in riparian areas. And if you want to get rid of it, it's a nightmare. You can't, good luck pulling it up. I mean, you'll be at it for the rest of your life. It has these long stolons that move through the soil, and it can regenerate from little pieces, and it's just much more difficult to pull.
Globalization moves seeds across borders, and development disrupts soils. But global climate change critically accelerates the takeover of ecosystems by invasive species. This issue is multifaceted. Some species find particular advantage in human-altered environments and may be better equipped for our warmer future, be it drier or wetter with changing climate patterns.
What we're seeing happening with drought and climate change in the last 25 years, we've come through a very long drought from 97 to, one could argue we're still really in it, but we've gone through this period of drought where we've lost a lot of topsoil, our riparian systems are declining in health, and that is going to continue. So regardless of what happens with rainfall, we're getting a lot of more evaporation with higher heat, more evaporation, more evapotranspiration. And so things like buffalo grass are able to kind of move up in elevation because the freezes aren't as often and not as severe. And so they're able to sort of elevational distribution ranges are changing, which is of concern.
Air pollution has led to nitrogen deposition in our desert soils, which tend to be nitrogen poor, and that can favor invasive species, invasive grasses. And changing precipitation regimes with climate change can favor invasive species. So we've been having some really wet winters, and not, out of the ordinary, but if that were to continue and they were to get wetter, that will favor winter annual invasives, which are really challenging to. Stinknet is one of those, and there's some other grasses like red brome that love the winter rainfall, thrive with the winter rainfall. And when you have a really wet winter, and then all that dries out in the spring, you have all this dry vegetation that forms this carpet across the desert. And that's a year you tend to have big wildfires. And then stinknet, right now it's invading both the urban and wildland environments, and it's more abundant in the urban environment. And it could be a real nightmare for just residents of Tucson. Their whole yards can be covered in stinknet before they know it, and it can be more than an individual might be able to manage. And so we're trying to get ahead of it with a lot of outreach and education, so that when people see a couple of stinknet plants in their yard, they get them right then. Yeah, you could still bag it and get rid of it, but as long as it hasn't gone to seed, it's an annual plant. So it's dead. So that's the last of that stink nut plant. But if it's already gone to seed, then you should pull it gently and stick it into a bag, and then tie the bag closed. And that way hopefully you'll get most of that seed, but some will certainly escape. And so you'll have to monitor that spot for the next few years to make sure. Buffalo grass, pull anytime you want. There's volunteer efforts that are pulling year round, even in the summer. And it's great to pull it before it goes to seed, but there's so much seed in the environment so there's an interesting species. Bermuda grass is the common, keep it mowed. It doesn't go to flower. It's also a terrible allergen, so don't let it go to flower and doesn't set seed. You can use it as a lawn grass. But if you want to get rid of it, it becomes invasive in riparian areas. And if you want to get rid of it, it's a nightmare. You can't, good luck pulling it up. I mean, you'll be at it for the rest of your life. Because it has these long stolons that move through the soil and it can regenerate from little pieces. And it's just much more difficult to pull.
Refugia is a concept originally from population biology. It refers to environmentally resilient spaces that have facilitated the survival of particular species in times of dramatic change to their original habitats. That could mean climatic change like past ice ages, geologic change, or human-caused disruptions like deforestation. The Indo-Pacific warm pool is one example of a historic refugium. It is a unique marine environment with consistently warm surface temperatures where so-called living fossil plankton species have been discovered. That said, recent climate changes have caused the pool to double in size, and scientists are now monitoring vulnerable species in this globally significant habitat as they adapt to a new paradigm. Conservation planners are seeking to identify areas with geophysical features like favorable topography and soil composition that they anticipate will be buffered from the most drastic effects of climate change to serve as refugia for vulnerable species in the future. This includes in situ refugia, which will allow species to remain in their current habitat ranges, and ex situ locations, where they predict a species can move in response to changes, either passively or through assisting interventions. Species in the Sonoran Desert, both long established and newly emerging, are adapting to local manifestations of climate change. Spittlebugs, historically common in the southern Sonoran Desert, are now appearing in greater numbers in the north, in places like Arizona. Their migration is of note because they are one of the few species that is adapting to eat invasive buffalo grass. But new species are also evolving. One particularly concerning newcomer is a plant known as stinknet. First observed in northern Phoenix about 15 years ago, it has surged in numbers recently, especially after good winter rains, and it's migrating southward. Compared to buffalo grass, stinknet is proving even more challenging to manage.
We thought it was really fast, and then along came stinknet, and so much faster. It came somehow to Southern California, and it's abundant in Southern California, San Diego area. And then somehow it jumped from Southern California to Phoenix, and then it's spread all over Maricopa County, and then it's traveling down I-10 to Tucson. You don't need to necessarily collect data on it when you see these vast tracts of desert that are now a monoculture of stinknet. And then it's fueling fires. There have been fires in Cave Creek area in Maricopa County, and structures have been lost, homes have been lost. And after a fire, the stinknet comes back and thrives, and native species struggle. Right now, it's invading both the urban and wildland environments, and it's more abundant in the urban environment. And it could be a real nightmare for just residents of Tucson. Their whole yards can be covered in stinknet before they know it, and it can be more than an individual might be able to manage. And so we're trying to get ahead of it with a lot of outreach and education so that when people see a couple of stinknet plants in their yard, they get them right then.
Take care of that situation early, because in the case of stinknet, tens of thousands of seeds in one plant. So you get one plant, you're going to prevent potentially hundreds of others the next year. And also people are having some issues with sort of respiratory issues related to this species. It has an oil that's very toxic. And so we're encouraging people, for example, to use gloves. Don't travel in the car with a bag full of stink net, hopefully in the back of the car, but really tied up so seeds aren't, dispersing. So that one is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, it appears to be an allergen, a common allergen. Not everybody, but a lot of people are pretty allergic to it. And a lot of people, even if they're not allergic, they don't enjoy the smell of it. It emits terpenes, which are chemicals which plants use to defend themselves against herbivores. They can cause rashes in some people. Inhaling a lot of it can cause respiratory distress in some people. But those compounds may also make it useful for maybe as a potentially medicinal plant.
Of course, people have always been exploring ways to make the best of their situation by finding potential uses for invasive plants. Over the modern period of accelerated change, Native communities have already shown remarkable adaptability, finding ways to use new species introduced to this region within existing practices and foodways.
Watch the slow transformation of these most magnificent saguaro forests in the world. I mean, these are some of the densest stands of saguaros in the world into a bufflegrass grassland. Cheatgrass, I know that they've figured out how to brew beer from cheatgrass. So there are definitely uses, and we shouldn't just, have disdain for these species. We should try and be creative and think about how we might be able to use them. Buffalo grass has been being used by a guy named David Walker, a really ingenious guy who has been clearing buffalo grass from a mountain for many, many years now. And he has collected a bunch of it and turned it into some sort of adobe cob and built structures out of it. And he has this, I think, a really fun and exciting idea to build, small homes that are well designed for this climate, for this region, that don't necessarily have, modern HVAC system, but yet they maintain the climate. And so there's a few examples of, I think he's got 3 or 4 buildings that he's built in the Menlo Park, Barrio Hollywood area.
What I'm really heartened by in the work that I do is feeling like I work for an organization that is responsive to the citizens. So the SDCP didn't occur in a vacuum. It occurred because there's a lot of people in our community who care about natural and cultural resources. If there wasn't, it wouldn't have been a Sonoran Desert Conservation Plan. So for me, success feels more about the community's continued ownership of their love of this place and their involvement in local government. They're attending our environmental ed programs. They're coming out to weed whacker events. The more that people are aware of their surroundings, the more they have experiences, that cool experience with seeing a Gila monster, paying attention to how many birds show up in your yard every year and what those species are. For me, just grounds me in this place. And I know that our culture, our world, we're getting busier and busier, and we tend to vacation like far away, and we have all these, experiences that are kind of external to where we live. And then we come back and we live in this space, and we work in this space. But I hope that we can take the opportunities to appreciate this place and to learn about it and to take more ownership of it.
Ultimately, ecosystems are relational and emergent, living and constantly evolving. Indeed, everything living on planet Earth has adapted to new and dynamic conditions. Humans have their part in maintaining these complex systems, but we don't and shouldn't have total control over them. But human actions are now speeding up changes at a staggering pace. If we want to continue sharing this planet with our more than human neighbors, we're right to keep exploring ways to address and adapt to these shifts. There are lots of ways to think about conservation, what it even means, and how best to do it. In the next episode of this pair, we'll hear from Indigenous practitioners and thought leaders on their perspectives on conservation and native species, perspectives that draw on generations of knowledge. For now, you can learn more by checking out the many resources and citations for this episode in the show notes. And we'll meet you back here next month. Thanks as always for listening.